It was a dusty, wind-blown evening on the edge of Dry Creek Ridge when the knock came, not a polite tap or a hesitant rattle, but a thunderous pound that made the wood of the cabin groan and the coffee in Jace Collins' cup ripple like a pond caught in a quake, the kind of knock that didn't ask to be heard, it demanded attention, startled birds from trees, made coyotes pause in mid-howl, and startled even the aging mule tethered out back into snorting wakefulness, and Jace, who'd been leaning back in his worn leather chair with boots unlaced and hat hanging on the antler hook by the door, jolted upright, the creak of the floorboards beneath him drowned out by the lingering echo of that unnatural bang, because in a place like Dry Creek Ridge, visitors didn't just appear, not unless it was a matter of life, death, or worse, unfinished business, and so with one cautious hand hovering near the pistol tucked under the table and the other reaching for the door, he opened it and stared out into the dusk, and the dusk stared back, towering and broad and impossible to miss, for standing there with one massive hand still raised was a woman who could have passed for a mountain given legs, shoulders like a barn beam, arms that looked like they'd once cradled whole trees, and eyes so gray and steady they seemed to suck in the fading light of the sunset itself, and she didn't flinch when he stared, didn't blink or offer a greeting, just stood there like an omen, a question, or both, until finally she said in a voice that made his floorboards tremble more than her knock had, "I was told you needed a wife," and it hit him, not like a joke or a misunderstanding but like prophecy, like something heavy was unfolding before him whether he liked it or not, and as he opened his mouth to speak, to explain that no, he hadn't ordered a bride like a sack of flour and definitely wasn't looking to be part of any stranger's matchmaking scheme. The woman moved to the side and revealed someone standing just behind her, and that's when things got even stranger because behind this living mountain of a widow was a girl young, maybe 17 or 18, no older than the dawn, slim and straight-backed, wearing a long coat that fluttered around her calves in the breeze, and her face, her eyes, those stopped him in his tracks because they were sharp and knowing, not the kind of eyes a child wears but the kind of eyes carved from long silence and watching. And though she said nothing, there was a knowing in her gaze, like she'd seen him before, like he wasn't a stranger at all but a name she had circled in her mind for months, years maybe, and Jace, for a long moment, couldn't find his words, couldn't reconcile the reality before him, a giant widow and a silent girl, with the solitude he'd been wallowing in since the fire took his ranch and the fever took his brother and the town forgot his name and left him to rot on the edge of nowhere. And he finally managed a hoarse wife. Like he was tasting the word for the first time, and the widow's lips curled into a smile that didn't quite reach her storm-cloud eyes. "I'm not here for me," she said, and the way she said it made the air feel heavier, like something sacred was being passed between them. "I've had my time, had my husband, had my grief," she continued, "but my daughter here, she needs a place, needs a purpose, needs someone steady and quiet and strong, and the stars said it'd be you." And Jace nearly stumbled backward because what kind of woman shows up with her daughter in tow to hand her off like some blessed burden based on a message from the stars? And yet, everything about her face told him she wasn't jesting, she wasn't deranged, she believed this as surely as he believed in the scars on his knuckles. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he started, trying to steady himself, "but this ain't how folks do things." And the widow didn't flinch, didn't even look surprised. "Folks don't do things the right way anymore," she said, "but we're not like most folks, are we?" And her gaze locked with his, unwavering, and then she added something that made his blood go cold. "You're Jace Collins, born near Willow's Bend, fought in the Battle of Crooked Ridge, your brother died from the sickness 3 winters ago. And you haven't had a real conversation with another soul in nearly a year, not since that preacher wandered up here and asked if he could bury his dog near the spring." And Jace's breath caught in his throat, because everything she said was true, all of it, even the detail about the preacher's dog, and no one should know that, no one unless they'd been watching or listening, or he didn't want to think about it too much, because the hairs on the back of his neck were already standing. "How do you know that?" he asked, half dreading the answer, and the widow just tilted her head and said, "Because my sister-in-law told me," and she heard it from the preacher's wife. who heard it from the blacksmith's boy, who said he overheard it in the saloon from the man who reshod your mule, and suddenly it made sense in that way things do when gossip and fate intertwine and everything seems ridiculous until you realize it's too specific not to be true, and Jace was too stunned to speak again, because now the girl was moving forward, slowly, carefully, like a wild deer not afraid but not trusting yet either, and the closer she got, the more he could see her skin was sun-kissed and freckled, her hands were roughened by work, not play, and her boots were scuffed in that way that says a person has walked miles not to run from something, but to run to something, and then she said the first words he ever heard from her, soft but clear, "I dreamed of you," and Jace's throat tightened because something about the way she said it didn't feel like poetry or flirtation, it felt like a memory, like she was recalling something she'd seen 1,000 times in her mind. "I dreamed of your boots. And your scar, and the sound of your cabin door when it creaks open," she added, and Jace involuntarily reached up to touch the old scar running along his jawline, the one from a bar fight years ago, the one he always forgot was there until someone stared at it too long, and this girl, this daughter of a giant, she wasn't just staring, as she was seeing him, the way no one had in years, and suddenly he felt exposed, not in a bad way, but like someone had read every page of a book he never meant to share, and before he could ask how or why or even begin to process this whirlwind of a visit, the widow stepped back and said, "I'll return in 7 days. If she's still here, it means she's chosen, and if she's not, no harm done," and with that, she turned and walked off into the twilight without a glance back, her long coat snapping in the wind like the end of a legend, and Jace, still gripping the doorframe, watched her go until the dusk swallowed her whole. Then turned his gaze back to the girl who had quietly stepped onto his porch, who now stood inches from him, looking up not with fear, but with something like challenge, like hope wrapped in steel, and he didn't know what to do, didn't know what to say, because this wasn't something you prepare for, wasn't something a man like him used to solitude and silence and the aching absence of things ever expects, and yet here she was, standing in his doorway, barefoot now, her coat hanging over one arm, looking at him like he was the last chapter in a story she'd waited too long to read. "I dreamed of you," she said again, firmer this time, as if she needed him to understand it wasn't just a girl's fantasy or a trick of the mind but something deeper, something rooted in the marrow of her bones and etched into the sky she'd slept under for so many nights since her father passed and the world became too quiet, and the words hit Jace like a wind through the canyon, sharp and low and full of things he didn't know how to hold, and as she stepped further inside his cabin, her presence was like a second sun, bringing with it a quiet heat that filled the gaps between the walls and the floor and the ache in his chest that had been there since he buried his last living kin under a patch of wildflowers by the spring, and he watched her look around, not with judgment or hesitation but with familiarity, like she already knew where the kettle was and how many steps it took to reach the firewood pile and that the creaky board was the third from the door. And she moved with a grace that didn't come from training but from understanding, the kind of grace that knew when to be still and when to speak and when to just breathe, and she said, "This place feels like it's been waiting," and Jace couldn't argue because it had. Hadn't it? Been waiting and hollow and frozen in time since the day he chose to let everything outside its walls drift into silence, and he said, "How do you know all this?" And she turned, her eyes catching the firelight just right, lighting up the flecks of gold in her irises, and replied, "Because I've seen it. Not in the way people see with eyes, but with the kind of sight you get when your soul is restless and the dreams won't stop, when the world feels like it's calling you somewhere and you don't know why until you get there." And Jace, for all his stubbornness, for all his time spent fighting things he couldn't control, felt something shift inside him like a stone moved from a river's path, subtle but permanent. And he stepped forward and handed her a plate with some salted pork and dried potatoes. And she took it with a nod and sat by the hearth, folding her legs like she belonged there, like she'd done it 1,000 times and lives neither of them remembered, and the fire cracked and popped and filled the space between their silences with warmth, and she said, "You don't have to believe me right now," and he responded, "I don't know what I believe anymore," and that made her smile, not mockingly but kindly, like she understood that confusion was a part of finding something real, and she ate slowly, savoring each bite like it was a gift, and he found himself watching her, not just her face but the way she moved, the steadiness in her hands, the calm in her breath, and he asked, "What's your name?" And she answered, "Laura," and the name hit him like thunder rolling across the plains because it didn't sound like a stranger's name, it sounded like something he'd whispered in his sleep once and forgotten, and she added, "It means laurel tree, in the old tongue, the kind that survives storms," and he said, "Fitting," and she looked up, one eyebrow raised in amusement, "You think so?" And he nodded, "You're here, aren't you?" And she chuckled, soft and low, and something about that sound made him feel like he hadn't wasted all these years keeping to himself, because maybe solitude wasn't about hiding, maybe it was about waiting for the right soul to fill the space you carved out of sorrow, and she said, "My mother said you'd be gruff," and he shrugged, she wasn't wrong, and they both laughed, small but genuine, and the moment stretched like dusk before dawn, slow and rich with possibility, and she said, "You're not what I expected," and he replied, "Neither are you," and she leaned back on her hands and stared at the ceiling beams. "I always thought love would be loud and full of fire, but these a broken bar. This feels like embers, steady and warm," and Jay swallowed hard because no one had talked to him like that in years, maybe ever. Not since the war and the loss and the silence, and he said, "I don't know how to be someone's dream," and she replied, "You already are, you just have to stop running from it," and those words, as soft as they were, hit like a hammer to the heart, because she was right and he knew it, and the truth of it scared him more than any outlaw or storm ever could, because it meant letting go of the fear, the pain, the grief, and making room for something new, something fragile and terrifying and real, and he said, "What happens if I mess it up?" And she looked at him, her face so open and honest it made his throat tighten, and said, "Then we fix it, together," and that word together was like rain on parched soil, and he stood there, hands at his sides, feeling the weight of choice pressed down on him like the moment before a horse rears or a gunfight starts, and yet he felt no need to run, only to breathe and stay and listen, and outside the wind had settled and the stars were coming out, blinking one by one into the velvet sky, and Laura stood and walked to the door and opened it, letting the night air drift in, and she looked over her shoulder at him and asked, "Will you walk with me?" And he hesitated only a second before grabbing his coat and joining her outside, where the land stretched wide and quiet and the moon hung low like a promise, and they walked side by side down the dirt trail that led to the edge of the bluff, and she said, "I used to walk alone like this, thinking maybe the stars had answers," and he asked, "Do they?" And she smiled, "Only if you're brave enough to ask the right questions," and they stood at the edge looking out over the hills and the old riverbed, and Jace felt something open inside him, like a gate long rusted shut finally groaning on its hinges, and he said, "Why me?" And she answered without turning, "Because your heart speaks in quiet, and mine's been listening," and he wanted to tell her about the nights he cried into his hands, the mornings he woke up hoping it would all end, the endless ache of living without purpose. But somehow she already knew, and that knowing, the shared understanding, wrapped around them like the night wind, and she reached out and took his hand, small and warm in his rough, calloused one, and the contact was electric, not wild and burning but sure and grounding, like holding the earth itself, and she said, "I don't need you to save me, Jace," and he nodded, "I wouldn't know how," and she smiled, "Good, because I'm not here to be saved, I'm here to live." And in that moment he understood that this wasn't a transaction or a prophecy, it was two lives colliding at just the right time, two hearts recognizing each other in the stillness, and they stood there until the moon rose high, hands clasped, breaths synced, and finally he said, "You could stay," and she looked at him with that fire in her eyes, that unwavering certainty, and replied, "I already have," and they walked back to the cabin under the stars. Not as strangers, not as wanderers, but as something new, something old, something inevitable, and inside, the fire still burned.